The sky over the Pacific was calm that morning, just another quiet stretch of blue meeting endless water. No one expected anything unusual. Fishermen were hauling in their nets, cargo ships hummed along their routes, and a few researchers on a floating lab were tracking whale songs. Then, without warning, the ocean split open. It wasn't an explosion. More like a sigh, deep, slow, and heavy. From the depths rose 3 battered vessels, their hulls scorched black, covered in strange symbols that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. They looked ancient, like relics from a forgotten age, yet impossibly advanced. Seawater poured off them as they settled on the surface, groaning like tired bones. Inside, silence. Then movement. Doors hissed open. Figures stepped out, tall, slender, with skin the color of moonlight on wet stone. Their eyes were large, dark, and filled with a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than sleeplessness. They didn't carry weapons, didn't shout, just stood there swaying slightly, staring at the sun as if they'd never seen one before, or hadn't seen one in a very, very long time. News helicopters arrived within the hour. Cameras zoomed in. The world watched, breath held, as these strangers, later called the Kailari, collapsed onto the decks of their broken ships, some weeping silently, others just kneeling, pressing their foreheads to the metal as though thanking it for carrying them this far. No one knew where they'd come from. At first, people guessed they were a secret military project or maybe actors in some elaborate hoax. But then scientists analyzed the ships. The metal wasn't from Earth. The energy signatures didn't match anything in human databases, and the language they spoke, soft, melodic, full of pauses like they were listening to something no one else could hear, had no roots in any known tongue. It took weeks to establish basic communication. A team of linguists, physicists, and doctors was flown in. They set up a floating quarantine zone around the ships, using old oil rigs retrofitted into a temporary camp. The Kailari didn't resist. They followed instructions with quiet cooperation, though their eyes never lost that haunted look. One of the researchers, a woman who'd spent her career studying how cultures express grief, noticed something strange. The Kailari never pointed at the sky, not once. When asked about their home, they'd look down at the water or close their eyes. Only later did anyone understand why. Through painstaking work, hand gestures, shared drawings, and eventually a crude translation device, they learned the truth. Their planet, Virelis, had orbited a star that didn't die in fire, but in silence. One day, it just stopped shining. Not a supernova, not a collapse into a black hole with drama and light, but a slow fade, like a lamp running out of power. Their sun didn't explode. It forgot how to burn. For years, their scientists tried everything. They sent probes, built mirrors, even tried reigniting the core with orbital lasers. Nothing worked. The star grew dimmer, colder. Crops failed. Cities went dark. Children were born who'd never seen daylight. And as their world froze, they sent out desperate calls across the galaxy. Pleas for help, offers of knowledge, anything. No one answered. Not the gleaming empires of the Andromeda Arm. Not the ancient machine cults near the galactic core. Not even the nomadic trader clans who crossed the void like desert caravans. Every transmission came back empty. Silence. It wasn't malice. It was worse, indifference. To the rest of the universe, Virelis was already gone. Why waste resources on ghosts? So the Kailari built arks, not warships, not colonies, just lifeboats. They packed what they could, seeds, recordings of their music, the ashes of their ancestors, and launched into the unknown, hoping against hope that somewhere, someone would care. Their journey lasted 43 years. Most of the original crew died in cryo-sleep from system failures. Children were born and raised in the dark between stars, taught stories of a green world they'd never see. By the time their navigation systems finally locked onto a habitable planet, Earth, their fleet was down to 3 ships, and only 212 souls remained. When they crashed into the Pacific, they weren't invading. They were arriving at the end of a very long fall. Back on land, the world reacted with fear. Governments scrambled. Military jets circled the quarantine zone. Conspiracy theories exploded online. They're scouts for an invasion, some claimed. Their biology could carry alien plagues, warned others. Politicians demanded they be moved to a remote island or sent back into space. But then came the first video that changed everything. A young Kailari, no older than 16, had been given paper and charcoal by a kind nurse. For days they sat on the edge of the rig, sketching. Not weapons, not ships, sunrises. Dozens of them, each one slightly different, as if trying to capture every shade of gold, pink, and orange they'd missed for decades. In one drawing, the sun peeked over ocean waves. In another, it rose behind mountains they'd only seen in books. The final sketch showed a small hand reaching toward it. That image went viral, not because it was perfect, but because it was human, or close enough. People started asking, what if they're not monsters? What if they're just lost? Still, fear ran deep. When a supply barge heading to the rigs was bombed by a small extremist group, killing 3 aid workers, the mood shifted again. Protests erupted. Earth first! Signs appeared in cities. The United Nations convened an emergency session. Many nations argued the Kailari should be relocated to an uninhabited asteroid, for everyone's safety. The Kailari heard the news through a translator. They didn't argue, didn't beg. One elder simply said in halting English, "We understand. The universe turned its back long ago. We do not expect Earth to be different." But something had already shifted, not in governments or headlines, but in living rooms, classrooms, and online forums. People began sharing stories. A fisherman who taught a Kailari how to tie knots. A doctor who stayed up all night holding the hand of a feverish child from the ships. A teenager who'd mailed a care package of socks, chocolate, and a handwritten note. Welcome to the neighborhood. The universe had abandoned them. But down here on this wet, noisy, messy little planet, something else was stirring, and it looked a lot like hope. Life on the offshore quarantine platform settled into a strange rhythm. Days were long, guarded, and filled with tension. The Kailari stayed mostly in their section, quiet, orderly, never causing trouble. They helped clean, folded laundry, and even started tending a small hydroponic garden using seeds they'd carried across light years. But every time a supply boat approached, their eyes flicked toward the horizon, tense, waiting. Fear had taken root on land, and it was spreading fast. News channels ran segments with ominous music and flashing graphics. Alien presence, threat, or tragedy. Talk shows hosted experts who claimed the Kailari were hiding advanced tech or carrying dormant viruses. One viral video showed a blurry clip of a Kailari touching a railing, then cut to a rust stain days later. Falsely labeled corrosive alien residue. It was nonsense, but it stuck. Online things were even messier. Reddit threads exploded with theories. Some users posted heartfelt messages. They lost their whole world. Can't we just give them a chance? Others replied with rage. They don't belong here. Earth isn't a cosmic homeless shelter. Moderators struggled to keep the peace. The subreddit r/Alien Refugees became a battleground, half support group, half war zone. A young Kailari, the same one who'd drawn the sunrises, kept sketching. Now they drew human faces, nurses, guards, the cook who always slipped them extra fruit. They didn't speak much, but their eyes watched everything. One afternoon they handed a drawing to a linguist working on translation. It showed 2 hands, one human, one Kailari, holding a single seedling in cracked soil. On the back, in careful English letters, "Your son still sings. Ours forgot how." That note made its way into a private report. Then somehow it leaked. Within hours it was everywhere. Poets quoted it. Musicians wrote songs about it. A teacher in Oregon had her class write letters in response. But not everyone was moved. To some it felt like manipulation, emotional alien propaganda. One commentator sneered. Then came the bombing. It wasn't a big explosion, just a muffled thud in the pre-dawn dark. A supply barge carrying medicine, food, and fresh water was hit by a homemade device as it neared the platform. 3 aid workers died instantly. 2 were volunteers, a retired firefighter and a college student studying intercultural communication. The third was a medic who'd spent weeks earning the trust of the Kailari children. The attack wasn't claimed by any major group. Just a fringe militia with a website full of rants about planetary purity, but the damage was done. Overnight, public opinion hardened. Protests turned angry. "Send them back" became a chant at rallies. Politicians who'd once called for compassion now spoke of national security and measured removal. At the UN, emergency sessions grew heated. One delegate argued the Kailari should be relocated to a barren asteroid in the outer solar system, technically habitable with life support, but utterly isolated. "It's not punishment," they insisted. It's containment. For their safety. And ours. The Kalari heard the news through a crackling speaker in their common area. No one translated it aloud, but they understood the tone, the clipped voices, the long pauses. That night, for the first time, some of them cried openly, not the silent tears of before, but deep, shaking sobs that echoed through the metal corridors. They weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of being erased again, sent into the void with no one to remember they ever existed. Back on the mainland, a quiet shift began. Not in governments, but in ordinary places. A fisherman who'd once delivered fresh catch to the platform now sat in his kitchen, staring at a photo of his grandson. He remembered how one of the Kalari elders had watched him mend nets, then mimicked the motion with trembling fingers, smiling when they got it right. He picked up his phone and called a local news station. "They're not monsters," he said, voice rough. "They're just people who ran out of sky." His words didn't make headlines, but they made it onto a community radio show, and from there into a podcast, and then into a post shared by thousands. Meanwhile, online, something unexpected happened. A user posted a simple thread. "My town has empty houses. We grow more food than we can eat. Why can't they stay?" At first, replies mocked the idea, but then others joined. "My garage is empty," could turn it into a room. "Our school has ESL teachers. We could help them learn. I lost my kid last year. If someone offered them a home, I'd do it in a heartbeat." It wasn't organized. No leaders, no plan. Just people, one by one, saying, "We have room." A retired teacher in Oslo sold her vacation cabin and donated the money to a legal fund fighting the deportation order. In Nairobi, high school students organized a walkout, holding signs that read, "No one is illegal under the stars." In rural India, a village council voted unanimously to offer land for a Kalari settlement, if they ever got the chance to leave the platform. The movement had no name, no logo, just a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, humanity could be better than the rest of the universe. But fear still held power. Death threats arrived at aid organizations. Graffiti appeared on buildings that supported the Kalari. And the UN vote loomed, just days away. On the platform, the young artists stopped drawing sunrises. Instead, they began sketching hands again. Human hands, Kalari hands, holding tools, books, spoons, soil. Each drawing was a quiet question. Can we build something together? One evening, a guard, someone who'd barely spoken to the Kalari, found one of the sketches tucked under his coffee mug. It showed him from behind looking out at the ocean. In the corner, tiny but clear, was the earth, glowing blue in the dark. He didn't say anything, but the next day he brought the artist a new set of colored pencils, small things, quiet things, but they added up. Because while the universe had turned its back down here, on this fragile, flawed, beautiful planet, people were starting to turn toward each other. And that, against all odds, might be enough. It started with a single post. Just a few lines on a forum most people had never heard of, buried under hundreds of angry rants and conspiracy theories. The username was unremarkable, just a string of numbers and letters, but the message cut through the noise like a clear bell. They lost everything. "We have spare rooms," no grand speech, no call to arms. Just that simple truth laid bare. At first it got a few upvotes, then a few replies, then hundreds. People began sharing their own stories. Not polished or perfect, just real. A farmer in Nebraska wrote about how his barn had extra space and how he'd taught his own kids to speak slowly so newcomers could understand. "Language isn't the problem," he typed. "Fear is." A librarian in Vancouver posted a photo of her community center's empty classroom. "We teach English to refugees from 10 countries. Why not 11? A teenager in Brazil shared a video of herself practicing basic signs in the Kalari gesture language she'd learned from leaked translation logs. "They're scared too," she said softly into the camera. "I just want them to know someone sees them." The thread grew. Then it spread. Not through algorithms or celebrity endorsements, but through something older and quieter. Word of mouth. A neighbor telling another over a fence. A student showing their teacher. A nurse texting a friend after a long shift on the offshore platform. Soon, people weren't just talking. They were acting. In a small town in Portugal, a retired couple opened their guest house, empty since their children moved away. and offered it as temporary housing. They didn't know if anyone would come, but they cleaned the rooms anyway, hung fresh sheets, and left a basket of oranges by the door. Just in case, they told the local paper. In Toronto, a group of university students pooled their rent money to lease a warehouse. They painted walls, installed showers, and stocked shelves with donated clothes and hygiene kits. They called it the Welcome Hub. No permits, no fanfare, just a place to land. Governments were still debating, still arguing behind closed doors. But out here, in the streets and kitchens and backyards of everyday life, something new was being built. Not with laws or treaties, but with casseroles, spare keys, and handwritten welcome notes tucked into coat pockets. Not everyone joined in. There were still protests, still hate mail, still voices shouting that Earth wasn't responsible for cosmic castaways. But the tide was turning. The bombing had shocked people, but it also made many ask, what kind of world do we want to be? One that meets fear with more fear, or one that meets it with open hands? Then came the art. The young Kailari artists' sketches, once confined to the platform, started appearing in unexpected places. Someone printed them on posters and taped them to bus stops. A street muralist in Berlin painted one on a brick wall, 2 hands planting a tree under a shared sun. In Seoul, a musician set the phrase, "Your sun still sings," into a gentle melody and released it for free. Within days, covers popped up in dozens of languages. Schools got involved. A teacher in Chile had her students write letters, not essays, just short notes. I like mangoes. Do you? My dog's name is Luna. We have a garden. You can help if you want. They bundled them into a package and sent them to the platform. The Kailari read everyone. Some cried. Others smiled for the first time in months. Religious groups, often divided on so many issues, found common ground. Churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues opened their halls as potential housing or community centers. A Buddhist monastery in Thailand offered meditation sessions for Kailari, struggling with Earth's constant noise and light. Peace isn't a place, their abbot said. It's a practice, and we can practice it together. Even businesses joined quietly. A bakery in Montreal started leaving loaves of bread at the local aid office with a note, "For our new neighbors." A tech company in Bangalore donated tablets preloaded with language apps and Earth documentaries. "Knowledge is the first bridge," their CEO wrote in an email that went viral. The movement had no leader, no headquarters, no slogan beyond simple decency. But it had momentum, and it had heart. Then something unexpected happened on the platform. A Kailari elder, frail but sharp-eyed, asked if they could help with something practical. They'd noticed the hydroponic garden wasn't producing enough. Using gestures and broken English, they explained a technique from Varelli's, layering roots in a specific pattern to maximize yield in low-light conditions. The human botanists were skeptical at first, but they tried it. Within weeks, tomato plants doubled in size. Lettuce grew thick and green. It was a small thing, but it changed everything, because it wasn't just about receiving help anymore. It was about giving it back. News of the garden spread. Suddenly, the Kailari weren't just victims or burdens, they were partners. A physics professor in Oslo reached out, curious about their star charts. A marine biologist in Sydney asked if they'd observed ocean currents in deep space. They had in ways humans hadn't considered. A group of engineers in Detroit invited them to consult on sustainable energy designs. "They've survived the end of a world," one said. "Maybe they know something we don't." Back online, the tone shifted again. Threads weren't just about, should we help them? But how can we learn from them? People began sharing photos of Kailari teaching human kids how to weave baskets from recycled plastic, or humming Varelian lullabies to soothe crying babies in the aid tents. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Misunderstandings happened. Cultural clashes flared. Some Kailari struggled with Earth's gravity, its loud cities, its concept of personal space. Some humans still flinched when they saw silver skin in a crowd. Trust wasn't built in a day, but every shared meal, every translated word, every repaired net or planted seed added another thread to a fragile but growing bond. And then came the vote. The UN session was scheduled for Friday. Rumor had it the deportation order would pass by a narrow margin. But that Thursday night, something extraordinary happened. From Tokyo to Buenos Aires, from Cape Town to Reykjavik, people gathered not in anger but in quiet solidarity. They lit candles, held signs that said Namaste, sang songs in languages the Kailari didn't understand but somehow felt in their bones. In one city, a crowd stood outside the UN building in silence for exactly 212 seconds, one for each surviving Kailari. The universe had turned its back, but Earth, messy and uncertain and full of ordinary people choosing kindness over fear, was finally turning its face toward them, and that made all the difference. The vote didn't go the way anyone expected, not because of speeches or political deals, but because something deeper had shifted. When the final tally came in, the motion to deport the Kailari failed, not by a landslide, but by just enough. Enough voices had changed, enough hearts had opened. The decision wasn't perfect, and it came with strict conditions, but it was clear. The Kailari would stay, not as prisoners, not as experiments, but as people granted protection under Earth's oldest promise to the displaced, "You can rest here." Relief washed over the platform like a slow tide. Some Kailari wept. Others simply sat down as if their legs had been holding them up for decades and could finally let go. But the real work was just beginning. Integration wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, awkward, and full of small stumbles. The first families who opened their homes quickly learned that kindness alone wasn't enough. The Kailari didn't understand why humans locked their doors at night. They were startled by the sound of car horns, confused by money, and overwhelmed by the sheer noise of cities. One elder accidentally set off a smoke alarm trying to warm their tea with a handheld energy device they'd carried from Varelli's. Another kept bowing deeply every time someone handed them a glass of water, a gesture of gratitude that made their host blush and stammer, "It's just water." But humans weren't perfect hosts either. Some asked too many questions, stared too long, or treated the Kailari like museum exhibits. Others, trying to be helpful, spoke loudly and slowly, as if volume could bridge the gap between worlds. Misunderstandings happened daily. A Kailari child once hid under a table for hours after a neighbor's dog barked. They'd never seen an animal before, and its sharp sounds felt like danger. A teenager refused to enter a school gym because the bright lights reminded them of the final days on Varelli's, when artificial suns flickered and died. Yet in those awkward moments, something beautiful grew. Patience. Not the kind that waits silently, but the kind that tries again. A teacher learned to dim the lights before class. A neighbor started walking their dog on the other side of the street. A grocery store clerk kept a quiet corner stocked with the Kailari's preferred fruit, a soft, purple berry they'd helped cultivate in community gardens. Slowly, routines formed. Kailari children walked to school with backpacks full of earth books and Varellian memory stones. Adults took jobs, not always the ones they'd trained for back home, but work that mattered, repairing bikes, tending gardens, coding software, even baking bread. One Kailari became known for their sourdough, dense, slightly sweet, and always shared with whoever passed by their window. Sports became a surprising bridge. In a neighborhood in São Paulo, local kids invited a Kailari teen to join their futsal game. At first, they stood on the sidelines unsure, but when the ball rolled near them, they kicked it, harder and faster than anyone expected. Laughter followed, then cheers. By the end of the week, they were on the team. The day they scored the winning goal, the whole block celebrated with music, grilled corn, and dancing that lasted past midnight. Not every story was joyful. Some Kailari struggled with grief that didn't fade. They'd wake up screaming from dreams of frozen cities and silent skies. Others felt guilty for surviving when so many hadn't. Human therapists worked alongside Kailari elders to create new ways of healing, blending Earth's counseling with Varellian rituals of remembrance, like floating paper lanterns inscribed with names into quiet rivers. But even in sorrow, connection bloomed. A retired nurse in Dublin started a weekly tea circle where humans and Kailari simply sat together in silence, sharing warmth without needing words. In a small town in Oregon, a Kailari elder taught quantum harmonics to university students, not as a lecture but as a song, using vibrations to explain how particles dance. The students didn't all understand the science, but they felt the music in their bones. Schools became places of quiet wonder. Kids asked the Kailari about stars, and in return, learned how to fold paper cranes or identify constellations invisible from Earth. Teachers noticed something unexpected. Bullying dropped. Not because rules changed, but because empathy grew. When a child saw their classmate flinch at thunder, they didn't laugh. They offered an earplug or a hand to hold. Communities built. Hybrid spaces. Libraries with books in both languages, community centers with rooms for meditation and storytelling, gardens where earth vegetables grew beside Varelian herbs. Murals appeared on walls, humans and Kalari planting trees, sharing meals, looking up at the same sky. Of course, not everyone accepted them. There were still whispers, still people who crossed the street to avoid them. But those voices grew, quieter, drowned out by the everyday hum of shared life. Laundry hung on the same lines, tools borrowed over fences, recipes exchanged at farmers' markets. One evening, a Kailari who'd been adopted by a human family stood in their kitchen, trying to flip pancakes for the third time that week. The first 2 batches were charred. The batter was too thick, but they kept trying. Their guardian didn't take over, just leaned against the counter smiling and said, "You'll get it. We all burn the first few." That moment, small, ordinary, full of flour and laughter, was the real victory. Not flags or treaties, but burnt pancakes and second chances. The universe had turned its back. But here, on this spinning blue dot, humans and Kailari were learning to face each other. Not as saviors and saved, but as neighbors, as friends, as people who, despite everything, chose to build something together. One awkward conversation, one shared meal, one sunrise at a time. 10 years passed quietly, like leaves turning in the wind. The world didn't change overnight, but it changed all the same. The offshore platform where the Kalari first landed was no longer a quarantine zone. It was a museum now, open to the public. Visitors walked through the old corridors, touching the walls where drawings once hung, reading plaques that told the story not of invasion or mystery, but of arrival. One display held a simple charcoal sketch of a sunrise. Beneath it, a line in both English and the flowing script of Varelli's. Here, the universe ended. Here, humanity began. That morning, in a sunlit room at the United Nations, one of the Kailari stood at the podium. Not as a guest, not as a symbol, but as a diplomat, the first of their kind. They wore simple clothes, earth-made but stitched with a silver thread from their old world. Their voice was calm, steady, shaped by years of learning not just language but the rhythm of human hope. They didn't speak of technology or treaties. They spoke of small things, of the first time they tasted rain and didn't flinch, of learning to ride a bicycle, wobbling down a quiet street while a neighbor ran beside them shouting encouragement, of sitting on a porch at dusk, sharing silence with someone who'd lost a child long ago and realizing grief. 2 could be a bridge. "You gave us back our names," they said, looking out at the room filled with delegates from every corner of Earth. "When the stars went dark, we thought we'd be forgotten. But you saw us, not as aliens, not as problems, just as people who needed a place to stand." Outside, the city buzzed as usual, cars honking, street vendors calling out, children laughing on their way to school. But on walls across town, new murals had appeared overnight. One showed hands, human and Kailari, planting a tree whose roots stretched into soil shaped like Earth, and whose branches reached toward a sky full of both familiar and foreign constellations. Another simply read, "Home is where someone saves you a seat." Life had settled into something ordinary, and that was the miracle. Kailari kids graduated high school, argued with siblings, fell in love, and forgot to take out the trash. Human families celebrated Kailari holidays, soft evenings filled with harmonic singing and shared stories of ancestors. In rural villages, Kailari elders taught farming techniques that worked with less water, helping communities adapt to changing climates. In labs and classrooms, their knowledge of low-energy systems sparked innovations that cut pollution and waste. There were still challenges, of course. Old fears didn't vanish completely. Some people still eyed Kailari with suspicion, especially in places far from cities. But now, when hate surfaced, others stood up, not with anger but with presence. A shopkeeper in a small town once refused service to a Kalari customer. By evening, neighbors had gathered outside with candles and signs that read, "This town shares bread." The shopkeeper reopened the next day with a handwritten apology taped to the door. The real change wasn't in grand gestures, but in the everyday. A bus driver who learned a few Kalari greetings. A librarian who stocked books in both languages without being asked. A teenager who invited their Kalari classmate to prom, not as a statement, but because they liked them. Back in the apartment they now called home. The young Kalari who once drew sunrises stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes again. The first one stuck to the pan. The second came out lopsided. But the third? Golden fluffy, almost perfect. They grinned and snapped a photo, sending it to the person who'd taught them how to crack eggs without making a mess. A video call rang. On screen appeared the face of the linguist who'd first tried to understand their language all those years ago. Now gray-haired, smiling, holding a mug that read, "World's Okayest Guardian." "You burned the first two, didn't you?" the linguist teased. "Only a little," came the reply, voice warm with laughter. They talked about nothing important. The weather, a funny cat video, plans for the weekend. No cosmic speeches, no heavy silences. Just two people sharing a moment like millions do every day across the planet. Later, as the sun set, the Kalari stepped onto their tiny balcony. The city lights shimmered below, and above, the stars blinked cold and distant. Once, that sight would have brought pain, a reminder of all that was lost. But now it felt different. The stars were still silent, the universe still vast and indifferent. But down here in this crowded, noisy, imperfect world, there was warmth. There was belonging. In schools, children learned a new version of history, one that included not just wars and discoveries, but acts of quiet courage. The fisherman who shared his nets, the student who mailed socks, the stranger who said, "We have room." Teachers called it the turning, not a single event, but 1,000 small choices that added up to something new. The old arcs, once symbols of desperation, now stood in parks and museums surrounded by gardens. Kids climbed on them, not knowing they were ships, just thinking they were cool places to play. And that was okay, because survival wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. No one claimed Earth was perfect. People still argued, still made mistakes, still hurt each other, but something had shifted in the soul of the world. The idea that compassion was weakness had been quietly replaced by something stronger. The belief that caring for the lost wasn't a burden, it was what made us human. As night deepened, the Kalari went back inside, leaving the stars to their silence. The apartment was small, the couch a little worn, the fridge humming too loudly. But the table was set for two. Pancakes waited on a plate, and somewhere in the distance a neighbor played guitar, the notes drifting through open windows like a lullaby for a world that had chosen, against all odds, to be kind. The universe had turned its back, but Earth, with all its flaws and noise and stubborn hope, had opened its arms. And sometimes that was enough.